Welcome to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Good evening. I'm Professor Larry Jacobs. I'm Director for the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to an inaugural event of the Nakasaka Dialogues. It's a new lecture series at the center. It's committed to stimulating conversations about the state of public life and encouraging progress to our shared bonds. This event was sponsored and established through the support of Kiyoshi Nagasaka, who's sitting right here.
Yay!
Kiyoshi, a Humphrey School alumnus, has been a great friend to the Humphrey School, the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance, and the Policy Fellows Program. Thank you, Kiyoshi. We're most generous for your support. And I want to just give folks a shout out who are joining us online. You'll see at the bottom of your screens there's a Q&A button. That's your invitation to join our conversation. We welcome a whole range of questions. If you've got questions that are different from what you're hearing, we have a particular interest in those questions. So give us your questions. You'll also see on your screen there's a transcript button, and if you'd like that service, please click on it as well. It's now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest, Thomas Friedman. Tom Friedman is a three-time Pulitzer Prize winning columnist for the New York Times. He's author of 7 best-selling books, including From Beirut to Jerusalem, The World is Flat, A Brief History of the 21st Century. And as many of you know, Tom Friedman is from Minneapolis, so this is a bit of a homecoming.
Yay! Go Twins! They got rid of mine, like you can get rid of yours too.
I'm going to keep mine.
You okay?
So Tom, you're always working on a book. What's the new book?
First of all, I just want to thank Yoshi. Thank you very much for sponsoring this. It's a treat to be back and to see you again. Dean, thank you for having me here. And Larry, it's been a long time intellectual inspirer and sparring partner. And Larry, thank you so much. Always enjoyed doing jazz with you. So I'm working on a new book on how to write a column. Since we live in an age where everyone wants to be a columnist, whether on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn or Medium. And so I thought I would write a book on how I did it, because there's no one way to do it. Broadly speaking, I can teach you how to write a news story, Larry. I can't teach you how to write a column. So the first I would call physics, the second I'd call chemistry. They're just real. One's called a doctor and one's called a dentist. They both get doctor as their title, but they're two very different functions. Because a news story is outer directed. There's a fire, I write about it. A column has to be inner directed. It's got to emerge from within you. And so the book is divided up. The first chapter is about, the first chapter is the first rule I learned in journalism, actually. And I was hired on, I went to graduate school at Oxford. I got a BA and a master's degree in Arabic and Middle East history, and I got hired on Fleet Street in 1978 by United Press International. And I worked on the desk, just more sort of moving wire stuff out. But after a few months, they let me go out on a story. And I'd actually never covered a news story. I got hired on the basis of actually some op-ed pieces I wrote. And the first story that sent me out on was to cover the takeover of the Iranian embassy in London by Iranian students. This was 1978. So I went down there at Chancery at my notebook, my pen. This is my first my first story was the death of Keith Moon, who was the drummer for The Who. But this was my first real story. And I go down to the Iranian Chancery and I talked my way into the building, talked to the students with other reporters we got in, and interviewed them. Anyways, I went then to dictate my story into the desk. And that involved actually standing in line at a little red phone booth, a British phone booth in London, and waiting your turn. Because, of course, there was no cell phones. So I dutifully waited my turn. I got to the front of the line, opened my notebook, I'm pouring it out, and the person taking dictation had a question about something. And I fatefully said to him, Arsha will appreciate, I said, wait a second, I'll check. And I opened the door of the phone booth, and I told the guy in line behind me, could you hold the phone for a second? I got to check something. And I went out to check. As soon as I was gone, he walked into the phone booth, slammed down the receiver, and said 2 words that I will never forget. Sorry, mate. And that was the first rule of journalism: never ask the competition to hold the phone for you. Okay, so the first chapter is basically about why I write. The second chapter is what makes a column, because a news story has to inform, but a column has to work. Those are 2 different things. What makes a column work? There's an epigram beginning that chapter. It says, honey, this column didn't work, and Friedman. Okay, because my first editor is my wife. So I explain what makes a column work, because a news story is meant to inform, a column is meant to produce a reaction, as I said. The next chapter is how I learn, because everyone learns differently. So I explain how I learn. And then the next chapter is the biggest lessons I've learned. And then the book basically shifts to what I saw, because I've been doing this now for 40 years, and I think we were all here for a pretty big moment. So the last 5 chapters are, what's the biggest thing I saw? What's the biggest challenge I saw? What's the worst thing I saw? What's the best thing I saw? And what's the most hopeful thing I saw? And that's the back half of the book. And if the world would just give me a chance, Larry, I would finish it. But there's so much going on that I was working on it this morning. You know what I mean? But that's what it's about, basically. But it's really meant to be not an allegory, but to try to give people a sense of how I navigate the world. Basically, how I make sense of things. And because we do live in an age where everyone wants to, and it's a beautiful thing, everyone can be out there with their opinions. And so I thought I would do this. So I'm having a lot of fun, because the best thing about a book is actually learning. I actually have a chapter, and Minnesota is a big part of this, which is on what is my worldview, and where did it come from? And my worldview is a product of how I lean and how I learn. That's a fusion of the 2. And how I lean is a product of where I grew up, and basically how I learned. And so because I grew up in a time and place when politics worked, I've never been able to shake that. So my column has a optimism bias, which got me into enormous trouble over the years. But it does have an optimism bias, because I grew up, I saw pluralism work in my experience growing up, and I saw politics work, because I grew up at a time and place when politics in Minnesota really did work. And so my column, if it had a real honest name to it, wouldn't have been called Foreign Affairs. It would have been called Always Looking for Minnesota. That I've basically been for 40 years. I go around the world and I developed an unerring sense to find the Minnesotan wherever I went. So the Iraqi who thought like a Minnesotan, the Israeli, the Palestinian, the Russian. And as I said, it's gotten me into a lot of trouble, but I wouldn't trade it in. That's who I am. That's part of my identity. But I've also tried to explain, and I'll stop here, a couple things I would share. One is, what is my worldview? Because anyone who follows me knows that, the shorthand is I'm kind of a centrist, but actually to me, it's much more complicated than that. That I really believe that the world is best understood through tensions. Okay, so I would describe my politics as I'm a pro-business Democrat. Okay, there's about 3 of those left in the zoo, but that's what I am. In the Middle East, I'm not a dove. I'm actually a bastard for peace. I saw some crazy stuff in that part of the world. On the environment, I'm not a green. I'm a mean green. I believe unless you have a serious energy policy along with your environmentalism, you're not going to get anything done. And so I have a very pluralistic view of the world and of thinking, and I believe those tensions, I believe I'm not out to harmonize them. I'm out to harness them. That you're only going to get green energy if you harness it to the market. You know what I mean? So I'm always putting things together like that. Where that come from, I don't know. But that's how I see the world. And that's frustrating for some people, and others totally get it. So that's what it's about.
Well, thank you, and I'm sure we've got a lot of readers looking forward to.
I hope so, yeah, if I could only finish it.
Well, let's dive into some of your recent columns.
Yeah, please.
One of the most recent ones was an extraordinary column, I thought, on China. And it puts into practice, actually, a lot of what you were just talking about. And you start out by saying, look, there's a lot of attention to Taiwan as really the point of tension and the problem. And you say, no, it's actually not the problem. You say, at one point, China has made itself a less trusted partner right when the most important technology for the 21st century, semiconductors, required unprecedented degrees of freedom to manufacture more and more devices and services as they became deep and dual use as both the tool and the weapon.
Yeah. So the point here, and that's a classic case of, I'm the only one in the world who would have written that column. I don't say that immodestly. It's because so much of the column actually came out of my book. People wouldn't realize. So let me backtrack there just for a second about the moment we're in, because I believe we're at a Promethean moment, and I've been introducing this just a little. So Promethean moments are moments when you get the introduction of a new technology or way of thinking that doesn't just require you to change one thing, it requires you to change everything. How you govern, how you learn, how you do commerce, how you fight wars, how you commit crimes, how you legislate. You have to actually change everything. We know what these Promethean moments are: printing press, scientific revolution, agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, and this moment where we're in. We're in a Promethean moment. It's amazing. This isn't just presentism. When the printing press was invented, some monk said to some priest, "Now that's really cool. You mean I don't have to write these Bibles out longhand anymore? You know what I mean? We're just going to print them? Holy mackerel." Well, that's ChatGPT. We are here for, I just asked this thing, and it gives me the answer. We're here for a Promethean moment, and it's going to change everything. And so what is new about our Promethean moment, let me just hold that thought. I will share with you in the audience, because relevant, we're at a university, how I learned, because the two are interrelated. So I learned by going to the edge of 3 different realms. I only understood this 40 years later. I did not know this 40 years ago when I started the University of Minnesota. Because it's at the edge where you get to really see things clearly, because it's all stressed. So I learned by going to the edge of 3 different realms. I first went to the edge of human behavior. I lived in a civil war in Beirut for almost 5 years. That's a long time to live in a civil war. And I got to see how human molecules behave at extremely high temperatures in a way I never could have in St. Louis Park. I got to see what people are capable of for extreme evil and amazing kindness under enormous pressure. And Beirut taught me to be an anthropologist, because in Beirut there was no data. The only data was talking to another human being. So I developed early on a very anthropological approach. You want to know what's going on? Ask people, If you're caught in a line in front of me or behind me, be careful. I will interview you. You know what I mean? I think talking to another human being is data, and I think everyone has something to teach you. So that's one edge I went to. The second edge I went to is the edge of technology. So I came, even though I'm technically the foreign affairs columnist, a lot of people didn't understand this at the beginning. I spent a lot of time at companies, big global companies, Microsoft, Amazon, Infosys in Bangalore. And I show up and say, don't care about your quarterly earnings, don't care about your stock price, your next CEO, or your annual revenues. Just want to do two things here. I want to hang out in your research lab. I want to know what's going on in the tip of your spear. Because if you want to understand the future, hang out with the people who are inventing it. And in your HR department. So I'm the foreign affairs columnist. I got to know all these HR people. Because I want to know how you're training your people for the future you're inventing. Because my intuition was, that's coming to a Minnesota near me eventually, okay? And the third thing I did was because my wife Ann was on the board of Conservation International, a wonderful NGO, environmental NGO. I traveled I visited every pristine ecosystem on the planet. U.S. Navy took me on their ice exercise beneath the Arctic in a submarine for 36 hours. I get to do a lot of really cool stuff. And I did it first to learn about nature, and then I did it to learn from nature. Because I came to realize that this globalization system I was describing was so complex and intertwined. There was only one thing that mirrored its complexity, and that was the natural world. So that meant nature could be a huge mentor. And so I asked myself the question, which ecosystems thrive in nature when the climate changes? Those that build complex adaptive networks, all the elements of the ecosystem network together. And nature does this emergently. The ibex eats the grass, the lion eats the ibex. It's done violently. But when those interdependencies are healthy, you have a very stable ecosystem that is adaptive, productive, and resilient. So I just took that model and I applied it to human communities. What would make a stable Minneapolis when the climate changes? The climate of technology and the climate of the climate. One where people were able to build complex adaptive coalitions, where business, labor, entrepreneurs, educators, philanthropists, and social entrepreneurs all formed a coalition together to what? Maximize their adaptability, resilience, and productivity. And so the best way I explain this to people is then what my design innovation was to arbitrage all three together. So I live by the motto, a teacher of mine, Lynn Wells, a defense analyst, taught me a while ago, which is never think in the box, never think out of the box. Today you must think without a box. So I'm completely seamless. There are no silos in my world at all. There are no departments at the University of Tom Friedman. Okay, there's just one seamless flow between these three things. Now, the way I can explain it is so I got my graduate degree from Oxford in 1978 at a classic British Arabist education. If we go back in 1978 and pull that version of me forward, sit him here, and say, Tom, what just happened in Syria? That version of me would tell you, Larry, that Syria had a coup. It was like when Adib Shishakli overthrew Mohammed Jones in 1954. I'd have given you some one-dimensional historical answer. If you ask this version of me what happened, this version of me will tell you that Syria had the worst drought in its modern history. From 2006 to 2010, 1 million Syrian farmers and herders left their homes, flocked to the cities, overwhelmed the infrastructure. President Assad did nothing for them. Then they got on these babies and watched the revolution in Tunisia and Egypt, and then they blew the lid off the place. So it was the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law all converging together. And if you don't look at the world in 3D, you won't see what's going on. So I'm always looking at it in 3D. Now we go to, so what am I seeing? I'm seeing we're at a Promethean moment, only our Promethean moment's different from any other. Our Promethean moment involves not only not a single device, like a printing press. It's actually a technology supercycle. It's our ability to sense, digitize, process, learn, share, act. We're putting that cycle into everything. And from your toaster to your F-35, okay? And it just goes faster and faster. As each part improves, the whole improves. It just goes faster and faster. But unlike any other Promethean moment, ours involves a climate supercycle at the same time. When we had the printing press, we were still in the Holocene. When we had the scientific revolution, we were still in the Holocene. When we had the industrial revolution, we were still in the Holocene. This is the first time we have an environmental supercycle, emissions, warming, ice melt, change in ocean currents, extreme weather, and a technology supercycle, both going at the same time. And my argument is that, and this is right up in your wheelhouse, what the convergence of the two of them did is that they blew up the politics of the last Promethean moment. So the politics of the last Promethean moment, it took us 100 years to figure this out. When the Industrial Revolution happened, we said, how do we get the best and worst cushion the worst from the Industrial Revolution? Well, what we said was, the way we do it, we eventually all settled on this thing called the welfare state. The welfare state had a Chinese communist version, a Russian communist version, an Eastern European version, a Western social democracy version, and an American New Deal version. And each of these welfare states were basically a set of walls, ceilings, and floors to enable workers to get the best and cushion the worst, and entrepreneurs. And left-right politics, very stable for 75 years, was a debate about how high the wall should be. Left said high walls, right said low walls. How thick the floor should be, the safety net. Left said thick floor, right said thin floor. How tight the ceiling should be. The ceiling was on the pace of change. And on incomes, left said linear change, right said nonlinear, left said low ceiling, right said no ceiling. That was our politics for 75 years, very stable. And then one day, I don't have to tell Larry this, every political party out of the Industrial Revolution blew up. The Tories became a Brexit party. It was an international business party, became a Brexit party. The Liberals in the UK disappeared. Their leader is now the spokesman of Facebook. How weird is that? Labor became Marxist, then they came back a little to the center. Republicans became a Trump cult. Democrats are teetering, on blowing up all the time. Israel, all they have is elections now. Their founding parties basically disappeared, the Labor Party. I have no clue who governs Italy today, but I don't think they're called Christian Democrats anymore. So something happened. Every major political party out of the Industrial Revolution blew up. What happened? My two supercycles reached critical mass, and they blew off the ceiling, blew down the walls, and crashed through the floor. And suddenly, these parties were no longer fit for purpose, because this birthed a whole new set of challenges that could not be governed left-right. They could only be governed from the center out with, say it with me now, complex adaptive coalitions. So what are the problems? Problems are the world got really fast. That is an education problem. How do you educate in a world where the pace of change is this fast? The world got really fused by technology and by climate. So more strangers, in Minnesota's experiences, are now encountering more other really strange people faster than any time in history, whether it's in Europe or the United States. The world got fast fused, got really deep. Technology started to go deep, so deep that the University of Minnesota couldn't just say that's medicine. They'd say that's deep medicine. That's not a fake, that's a deep fake. Oh, that's not research, that's deep research. We had to invent an adjective to describe the fact that technology had gone somewhere where I don't know where it is anymore. And it even infected the popular culture. The song that won the Oscars 3 years ago by Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper was called Shallow. But what was the main verse? I'm off the deep end, watch as I dive in. I'll never reach the ground, crash through the surface where they can't hurt us. We're far from the shallow now. Oh, Larry, baby, we are far from the shallow now. Okay, technology's gone so deep. So we're got fast, fused, deep, dual. Now we're coming to the China column. When everything is connected, digital, everything becomes dual use. Now in the Cold War, we said, that's a fighter jet, that's a hammer, okay? That's a military, that's civilian. Now, with everything's connected and digital, everything's potentially dual use. What's the whole debate about TikTok? Oh my God, the Chinese may be studying our dance moves, of our kids, or whatever it is that people are worried about. Your toaster, if it's made in China and it's connected and it's online, the PLA may know you like your bagels dark brown. Who knows? Okay? But everything becomes dual use. Fast, fused, deep, dual, open. One of us can now talk to all of us. And we can hear each other whisper. We can hear each other whisper. And we whisper crazy stuff sometimes. Okay? So fast, fused, deep, dual, open, and fragile. Because what happened was we connected every node, and then we took out the buffers, and we greased the connections, and now instability in one node gets transmitted to the whole system, like from Wuhan, just like that. To govern a fast, fused, deep, dual, and open world, you can't do it from the left and right. You have to do it from the center out. So what happens? The two parties are no longer fit for purpose. What do parties that aren't fit for purpose do? They fall back on culture and tribalism in order to hold their adherence. Now, one party's doing it much more than the other. This is not a symmetrical situation. I think the Democrats actually are much more of a complex adaptive coalition than the Republicans. But that's the problem today. And so that's why these parties are not, so that's actually the biggest thing I saw. That's the biggest challenge I saw, is how do we adapt to this? I will tell you the best thing I saw. The best thing I saw, I think, in my 40 years, this shocks people when I say this, but then when I say it, they start to realize it. I think the best thing that happened in my life, in the 40 years I've been a journalist, was the creation of the European Union. That a continent that was synonymous with tribalism, basically, tribal wars, going back millennia. The last three of which required us to send 1 million of our brothers and sisters over to quell the violence, the World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, suddenly became another United States. A United States of Europe, a giant center of free markets, free people, human rights, and democracy. We are the first generation of Americans to live in a world of 2 United States, not just one. And if that doesn't float your boat, you're not paying attention, okay? That is a huge, huge thing, that we live in such a world with another United States. That's the best thing that happened. And I'll just end this question here. What's the worst thing that happened? The worst thing that happened in my life is that, so I'm really into my favorite plant in nature. It always goes back to nature, which is my mentor. My favorite plant in nature is the mangrove. Now, mangroves are these amazing forests that grow in coastal areas, mostly in salt water, but also in fresh water. And mangroves do 3 things in nature. They first filter toxins and pollutants. They turn salt water into fresh water. They prevent storm surges. So the villages in Indonesia, around Aceh, that took out their mangroves were wiped away. Those that didn't were completely protected from the tsunami. And they enable young fish to grow before their predators can eat them, because the roots of mangroves are very gnarled and very hard for big fish to get into. Mangroves are amazing evolutionary plant in nature. And the worst thing that happened in my life is that we lost our mangroves, but not just in the environment. Shame was a mangrove. It used to be that if you had had unprotected sex with a stripper 3 months after your wife gave birth, that you would be hiding under the bed, afraid and ashamed to come out, and the dog barking at you. You wouldn't be running for re-election. Shame was a mangrove, and we lost that mangrove. Political parties were a mangrove. You couldn't just go on the internet, raise money, say crazy stuff to raise even more money, and go into politics. There were smoke-filled rooms. They discriminated. They did all those things, but they were also an important filter at their best. We lost that. Local newspapers were a mangrove. They filtered the news. They connected you to your community. We lost that. In my life, we lost our mangroves. And the end of the book is what's the most hopeful thing I saw, and this is something my friend Larry helped teach me. You can actually rebuild a mangrove in nature. It's very difficult. You need nature actually to cure nature. And you can rebuild a mangrove in politics. You need democracy to cure democracy. And it's called 2 things: open primaries and ranked choice voting. Okay? And you give me open primaries and ranked choice voting, and I will take a politics where we put all the cheese on the edges and we'll move it to the center. These politicians today, what they're doing is completely rational. We put the cheese on the edges. Where do they go? They go to the edge. Move the cheese, you move the mouse. And open primaries plus ranked choice voting will get you Lisa Murkowski elected in Alaska. Okay? A woman who voted to impeach Donald Trump, coming from the most conservative state in the country, wins election thanks to open primary and ranked choice voting. And that's our challenge. That's how we save democracy with democracy.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Now, if I could only write it all down, I'd be done.
Can I go back to China?
No, yeah. Oh, that's right. You did ask me about China, right? Well, the whole point about, just to answer your question about that, is that the whole idea of dual use. So what happens is when everything became dual use, is right when China, with Xi Jinping coming in, really made a U-turn. And suddenly we said, we can't trust this anymore, and that's the core of this whole thing now.
Yeah, I think what was really took me, and I think many others, was your penetration in a lot of the ways you were just describing, going past the surface, looking for the interconnections. I mean, in that column, you're talking about certainly business, but people you meet on the street.
Yeah.
You're talking about really large political changes. I wanted to give you another perspective. This is from the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, who says that really our approach to China should be to modernize our military to such a degree that is overwhelmingly obvious to the Chinese they can't defeat that military. And he goes on to talk about what that revamping would be. And it's some of the same things you've been talking about: AI, robotics, quantum computing, and some of the big breakthroughs in biologics. So that's another perspective. That is a perspective not about trust and the social world and nature that you're talking about. It really is just brute force.
Raw brute force, yeah. I'm not naive about China. They're building up huge naval force, giant military modernization. Huge presence in space now. I'm not naive about it at all. But I've always believed that American industrial policy was something very simple: the Statue of Liberty. That was our industrial policy. That we live in a world where, last time I checked, brains were actually distributed equally around the world. What was never equal is the countries that would welcome them. And that has always been our competitive advantage. Has anyone here tried to become a Chinese lately? How about a Swiss? Japanese? Okay. The fact that we can welcome to our shores all these people and bring them to Minneapolis and the University of Minnesota and make them, transform them into productive Americans and lead companies like Microsoft and Google and just go down the list, that is our advantage. And what worries me is we're throwing away our advantage just for brute force. Well, maybe we can do it with brute force, but there's actually 1.4 million Chinese, and there's only 350 million of us. And so that's not the game I would be playing alone. I'm not naive about it, but we're giving up on what is our advantage.
And I thought one of the big challenges of our time involving China is this kind of emergence of almost a Cold War mentality, that there's the enemy and then there's our side. And if you say anything that even sniffs of kind of an analysis or an admiration, then you might be suspect. And
I'm very suspect. Yeah,
and in this column, you actually say some people might think I'm kind of crossing the line here. And so this Cold War mentality seems to be drifting in, and with it, massive defense spending is just around the corner. It's got bipartisan support, but you point to something I think is so profoundly distinctive about this moment in our relationship with China, which is interdependence.
Well, Larry, I happen to think that interdependence is our condition now as a species. The only question is, will we have healthy interdependency or unhealthy interdependency? But we are going to rise and we are going to fall together, baby. The only question, is whether we do it rise together or fall together. But whatever we do, folks, we're doing it together. If you think we're going to be good and China's going to be bad, I don't believe that at all. And that's part of why I never go to where Milley goes. And that the debate around China has gotten really stupid in a dangerous way. I will tell you, there's a sort of consistent critique of me from the right on China, which you just have to Google it. You'll find it's all over the place, and I find it just so funny. I wrote a column, like 5 years ago, in which I made it wasn't not a column about China. It's a column about America. But the theme of the column was, there's only one thing worse than one-party autocracy, and that's one-party democracy. What I meant was that a one-party autocracy, I was referring to China, I said that if you have you're sitting down, thank God, Larry. I said, if you have a reasonably enlightened leadership, I dared to refer to China's leaders as reasonably enlightened by the fact that they actually believe in physics is what I was referring to. I'm not talking about how they treat Uyghurs, If you have a reasonably enlightened leadership, they can actually order a lot of smart things from the top down. When you have a one-party democracy, which is what we have right now, where one party is trying to govern and the other spends all its energies trying to subvert that party, you actually can't get anything done, which is why China has 900 high-speed rail lines and we have 15. And at some point, you have to look at that and just say, I spent a week in China. I wasn't worried. I walked everywhere. I wasn't worried I was going to get mugged, that a school was going to get shot up. I understand it's an authoritarian country. But it's not just that. At some point you have to just say, what are we doing here, folks? And that drives so there's a whole meme about me that I dared to say China had a reasonably enlightened leadership. Well, I happen to think when you bring 800 million people out of poverty faster than any time in the history of the world, you should get some credit for that, And it's not that I don't acknowledge the terrible, abuses over here. I do that as well. But that's how stupid the debate is. And I find that this isn't perfectly true, but 105% of people who write about China haven't been to China. And so, and you have to go there and see, and by the way, in my piece, I laid out every bad thing they're doing, and that piece was quite welcomed in China, that they said it was fair. They knew that I hit them hard, but I acknowledge the fact, you walk down the street of Beijing, there are 50 buildings in Beijing that if one of them was in Washington, D.C., they're so big, it would be on the tour bus route. You need to see what they've built, but you need to understand, it looks just like Dubai. It looks just like Dubai, with one difference. This was all built by their own savings, not by oil. One of the first things Chinese will tell you is that everyone remembers how many pants they had to sell to buy one Boeing. And you better take that seriously, that this isn't just about autocracy. This is about a people with a sense of solidarity and destiny, and they will pull, for their own success and leadership to some degree. So hey, when you're in this job, if you aren't challenging the status quo and whatever the conventional wisdom, you're in the wrong job. I mean, if this is not a friend growth industry, that's one thing I explain to people who want to be a columnist. You want to do it right. This is not, if you want a friend, get a dog. Do not get a column, okay? Because this is like, just Google me and you'll know. It's just, I
think the pieces you've been writing about China,
yeah.
It's you're one of the few voices out there that has evidence that's kind of looking at the tensions as you talked about.
Yeah, it's exactly right. There's a tension here,
and tensions within China and within the U.S. and that it's rarely one-sided. And the interdependence, the U.S. can't survive in the current system without China.
Yeah,
and ditto for China.
Exactly, and that's what I'm trying to say. By the way, to both, I'm saying to the Chinese. I'm asking the same question in both capitals in my own little way. Where are you going with this? That's what I was asking in Beijing. Where are y'all going with this whole thing that you're doing? On Taiwan with Uyghurs, I did the whole thing. When I'm over there, I'm a pain in the ass to them. But the one of the things you need to learn when you're a journalist, first thing you need to learn is which critics to listen to, because there's two kind of critics. There's those who want to take you down, and those who want to make you better. Those are two very different animals, okay? And I have no time for people who want to take me down. People want to make me better, I will listen to them. And what do they have in common, the people who want to make you better? They're on the level. They're on the level, you know what I mean? And so I try to be for the Chinese that person. They know I actually want this thing to succeed. I have great respect for them. I have many friends in Beijing over the years. And so they know I'm on the level. So when I show up, it isn't just I'm trying to kick them in the shins. And they understand that, and so they keep inviting me back, even though I give them indigestion, because to me the goal of a columnist is the highest compliment I think you can get as a columnist, if you were writing a column about me, Larry, and I say to you, Larry, go ahead, you really annoy me. That is the highest compliment you can get in journalism. It means, God dang you, you know, you just annoy me, okay? Because there's something to what you're saying. You know what I mean? And you kind of got me. And this comes from Bob Wright, who writes a wonderful blog called Bob at Non-Zero, and he's a really smart guy, Bob. And he's a real skeptic on Ukraine from the very beginning. And I've disagreed with him, and he called me one day and said, "This is a good example of an on-the-level critic." He said, "I wrote a blog about you. I just want you to know, and I want you to read it." And so I read it. And I called him back. I said, "Bob, you really annoy me," you know. And he said, "Great, let's do a podcast." I said, "You're on." And then we did a podcast, disagreeing, and so many people wrote in and said, "God, it's just so refreshing to hear people disagree but respectfully," you know. And that was just so refreshing. And I'm always sending him herograms on things that I like of him, things I disagree, but we're trying to make each other better. We're not trying to look at me, I took you down, you know. You didn't take me down. I'm still here, okay? And you know, it's just there's just so much of that in journalism today.
So Tom Friedman takes out of Minnesota optimism. You talked about optimism. And here I'm reading in your column, you said there are three things in the world that could bring the world to an end, to the collapse. And you list them. One is Israel becoming an autocracy, Ukraine falling to Putin, and Donald Trump coming into the White House again. That would bring us to the edge.
The three of them together, I think, would change the world. You know, the Middle East would be completely different. The only functioning democracy there would be gone. If Ukraine were to fall to Putin, I think it would threaten my European Union that I talk about. And as I said on Smirconish last weekend, Donald Trump must never, ever, 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 ever occupy the White House again. He is a danger to this country, unlike anything we've ever faced before. And I'm doing everything I can in my own little way, and it's only little, but to make sure that doesn't happen.
So both of us know plenty of Republicans,
Yeah.
and Republicans that I respect and, you know, take to be reality-based, and they'll say, yeah, you know, Donald Trump is, I don't approve of the way he talks and expresses himself, but he reflects kind of some of the core values. And they look at Joe Biden and they say, okay, Joe Biden, you know, nice guy, good smile, nice sunglasses, but the guy is moving forward with a fairly significant amount of government activism, looking for tax revenue, and it's an industrial policy, it's social policy, and they just disagree with that. And they say, okay, well, the way we're going to stifle, the way we're going to blunt this or check it, is to support the candidate who can take over the White House, and Donald Trump may be that candidate. What's wrong with that?
Because one is a threat to the republic and the other isn't. The biggest thing Joe Biden could deliver is inflation. That would be bad. I think we should all work against it. If he's wrong, the worst we get is endemic inflation. If Trump has 4 more years, the worst we get is, I think, the collapse of our democracy. You know, so those are two. In my view, I know you're asking the question rhetorically. That's why I ask it. You know, my view of I see America. You know, I've written. You know, Israel. I watch Israeli politics very closely because Israel is to America what off-Broadway is to Broadway. Okay, so things happen in miniature there and then come to Broadway. And so, what was the big question in Israel's last election by the super-nationalist, religious nationalist party? They actually took out ads on buses that basically asked in Hebrew, whose country is this anyway? In Hebrew is, who's the landlord here? Yeah. And as I travel around the world, there is no more universal question being asked today. In Italy, France, Israel, whose country is this anyway? And that's because the world's gotten fused faster than a lot of people could adapt to. And I think, and this was the theme of my last book, that basically Americans woke up one day and went to the grocery store, and the woman at the cash register wasn't wearing a baseball hat. Then they went into the men's room, and there was a woman next to them, and she had a penis. And then they went to work, and their boss just rolled up a robot and seemed to be studying their job. And all happened at the same time. My sense of home, my sense of social norms, and my sense of work all got completely disrupted at the exact same time. And then along came a guy named Donald Trump who said, I can stop. The wall was a brilliant metaphor. So it wasn't just about Mexico. It was, I can stop the winds of change. And so the question I find is roiling this country right now is, whose country is this anyway? It has a real racial overtone, but not entirely. It's DeSantis, it's sexual norms, gender norms, it's all these things together. And that, if you disrupt someone's sense of home, that's like stepping on an anthill of red ants. The ferocity, there are few things that will make people enraged more than taking away my sense of home. Wow, that's just, and that's what we're dealing with here. That's why it's so potent, and something Democrats need to be aware of too, and how they talk and how what policies they advocate. But that's why all my own journalism is how do we forge communities where people can feel connected, protected, and respected.
So if there was a Republican who accepted the norms of our democratic system, but articulated values about lower taxes, less regulations, more markets, you wouldn't have a problem with that.
I mean, I voted for Larry Hogan. Don't tell anybody this. I voted for Larry Hogan twice for governor of Maryland against a Democrat. My politics is not predictable at all. I think that one of the greatest presidents I got to cover closely was George H.W. Bush, and the people around him. I traveled with Jim Baker all 4 of those years, So I'm, it seems to me that if you ask me in my gut, what has to happen, I think Republicans have to lose one more election, the Trump Republicans, for them to go back and you'll remember that when Romney was defeated, they did that study, Republicans. Well, God, we just got defeated a second time by Obama. What do we need to do? We need to go back and go to the drawing board and have a multicultural, multi-ethnic, pluralistic party, and reach out to Hispanics and African Americans, all these different communities. They had a whole. Because I've been thinking of doing a column about that thing. Because I think, look, we're in our second Civil War, let's be honest, okay? The first Civil War was, whose country is this anyway? Slaveholders or freemen, you know what I mean? And the second Civil War is, whose country is this anyway? A multi-ethnic, multiracial, multilingual country that we'll forge an American identity out of, or the Mayflower, descendants. And I happen to believe, this is my hope, I think we're, all you have to do is look at kindergartens today in America to see what's coming, the what's going through this python, the cohort, that we are going to have a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-cultural country, and how we forge an identity out of that. This is my problem with the left, because I also really believe there's got to be a common American identity, and it can't just be which group you're from, and so. But I think we're in the process of, that's what our second Civil War is about.
And here's going to be the dilemma for that agenda, which is there will be groups of people of color who sign on to the Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis. So Ron DeSantis, did fabulously well among Hispanics.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump did much better among Hispanic men.
Yeah.
And, among Hispanic Americans, a large number are kind of many of the people you just described, kind of blue collar, less skilled, less well educated workers, and they're feeling some of the same frustrations.
Absolutely.
You're talking to someone from Venezuela or elsewhere, they're not that happy about Mexicans or else.
Exactly.
So that
very complicated. Yeah.
Right.
And to wind your way through that, to find a politics that can wind your way through that, is I think the challenge. I think I'm waiting for, Yeah, I think that I could have, my wife built a museum in Washington to promote reading, literacy, love of language, called Planet Word. If you haven't been there, it's awesome. But we have a speech making gallery where we teach young people how to make a speech, and you actually get to download one of 8 speeches. Oprah, and one of them is Obama's speech to the Democratic Convention, where he says there's no white America, there's no black America, there's no Hispanic America, there's just the United States of America. Well, I asked him once, what happened to that? I'm not going to share his answer, it was off the record, but it was like, but what happened to that?
Yeah.
We lost that. And that was, we got to get back to that. Now, where it lives is the U.S. military. And that's why I travel so much with the military, because that's where you really, don't tell me it can't work. I've seen it work. One of the things I talk about in my book was I've been a columnist since 1995. That's 28 years. Can't believe it. I've written a lot of columns. Whenever someone asks me, what's your favorite? What's your favorite? I tell them my favorite column is as in August 2017, Dave Goldfein, who is commander of the U.S. Air Force, asked me if I wanted to come with him on a trip to visit every U.S. air base in the Middle East at the height of the ISIS war. And it was an air war. I get to do amazing. I have the most fun you can have legally, you guys. I mean, I get to do amazing stuff. So I said, God, that sounds really cool. We do it. So we went off. It was, he has his own jet, he's head of the Air Force, so we stop at Ramstein Air Base, and we're heading for Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. And we get there, and Charlottesville just happened. Trump's talking about good people on both sides. And sometimes you're in the right place at the right time in this job. Sometimes you're in the wrong place at the right time. The whole world's talking about Charlottesville, and I'm in Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. And just spent the day at the base getting briefings. And I looked at my computer and thinking, what do I write? And it just hit me. And I said, folks, I'm here in Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. And I just want to tell you about my traveling party. I'm traveling with the head of the U.S. Air Force. He's Jewish. I'm traveling with the Air Force Secretary. She's a woman. I'm traveling with the Air Force Secretary's executive officer. She's an African-American Air Force Lieutenant Colonel woman. Her aide is called Cesar. Our briefing was from an Armenian American who commands the base here. His deputy is a Lebanese American. And Mr. President Trump, which part of this fucking sentence don't you understand? Okay, that this is what makes us powerful. That out of many, one. And that is what distinguishes it. Why we are powerful, and these people we're fighting are not, because we can make out of many one. And that is my all-time favorite column. I didn't get the word, the F word in there, but I got everything else in.
Tom, I want to circle back to a couple of your columns, which have been about Kamala Harris. And I've always found it strange, the amount of attention that she gets and the critical attention.
Yeah.
Because both of us, for me, from afar, have studied, in your case, so many vice presidents. And usually, yes, they become lightning rods here and there, but usually they're in the background. Cheney got a lot of attention.
Right.
But Cheney wanted attention, and Bush let him be the front of it. Joe Biden, there's large parts of the Obama years where Joe Biden disappeared. Why is it that Kamala Harris gets so much attention and so much negative attention?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. As I said in my column, I said, I think there's a certain amount of sexism and racism there. There's just no question about it. I think she was assigned tasks by her president that were impossible, the border. But I also think it has to do with the fact that she happens to be the vice president to a president who will be 86 if he runs and wins again. And therefore, there's a whole different level of scrutiny. Because you vote for Joe Biden this time, you are casting half a vote for Kamala Harris. And Kamala Harris did not win the Iowa caucus. She did not run in the Iowa caucus. She dropped out before the Iowa caucus. because her campaign was such a mess. And it was clear she didn't really know what she stood for. That is who you will be electing, and that's why my focus is there. So I was not picking on her at all. I was simply saying Donald Trump cannot be elected president. And the only way he's not elected, in my view, is if enough moderates and independents, moderate Republicans and independents, do in the next election what they did in the midterm, which is identify every election denier and defeat every one of them, virtually every one of them in every state, thanks to moderate Republicans and independents. What does that mean? It means I need them in this election. And therefore, I was saying not to get rid of Kamala, I was saying Biden, you've got to really be able to reach out you've got to connect with these people, because they are going to be voting for you this time. And I can't afford for that guy to win. So you become much more important. And I honestly sensed this early on, which is why in the transition, I wrote a column to her. And the theme of the column was, you're too smart to just be vice president. This is a job this is a nothing job. You should make yourself Secretary of State to rural America. Travel, spend your 2 years, all are focused on getting bandwidth to rural America, getting infrastructure to rural America, educational opportunities to rural America. It's a twofer. First of all, there's so many more African Americans in rural America than people realize. You can be an ambassador to them, but you can reach out to the Republicans who live out there who never will vote for a Democrat. So it's a twofer. You can distinguish yourself with a distinct agenda and do something good for the party.
Did she follow your advice?
No, never. Not even remotely. You know what I mean?
And your concern is that Donald Trump, were he to be the nominee, might pick someone like Nikki Haley, expecting these moderate.
It goes back to your very first question, which you rightly, I think, intuited. There's a lot of Republicans who don't like Trump. But if he appoints Nikki Haley or Tim Scott, that will give them a license to say, look, I mean, that's, I don't like Trump, but he's got a pretty good vice president. Be careful of that. Be very, very careful. Yeah.
Recently, the UN came out with a report saying that we're on course in the next decade to pass kind of the tipping point in terms of temperature on planet Earth. You've been writing about climate change for a long time. Where are you in terms of the optimism?
That's that optimism does not apply on that subject. Look, we're at a stage now where the best we can do is manage what's now unavoidable and avoid what would be unmanageable. And even that will take a huge effort. It's my view, again, my sort of complex view is that there's only one thing bigger than Mother Nature, and that's Father Prophet. Unless you harness your clean energy agenda to the market and the incentives of the market to get scale, you won't get scale. And I think that's what Biden's climate bill did beautifully. It's a really important piece of legislation, brilliantly designed to do just that, to incentivize the market to give us the scale and pace we need in order to have a chance to manage what's now unavoidable and avoid what will be unmanageable. But that's, look, I've lived in Washington now since 1988, and we had no snow this winter. We had a few flakes. In fact, the weather in Washington was basically between 40 and 55. It's been that way since September, and so that's what people say. What will happen when when we leave the Holocene and enter the Anthropocene, you won't have 4 distinct seasons anymore. And the weather, you don't get global warming, you get global weirding. The weather just gets weird. The hots get hotter, the wets get wetter, the dries get drier, the colds get colder. You get extremes in every direction. So we're just going to have to adapt. That's pretty clear. How much will depend on how fast we get to this next agenda.
We've got, I've been filtering in questions we're getting
Sure.
from our friends here and online. Maybe we have a lightning round.
Sure, go ahead, please.
First question, how can a society overcome the normalization of lying in public discourse?
It's just a great question and a hugely important one, and the only way to do it is to call it out, and shame people who do it. I mean, half of me wants to write a column that it's all Melania Trump's fault. Because had Melania Trump thrown Donald Trump's mattress out on the driveway, dumped all his clothes there, and kicked his ass and say, you will never come into this house again, we might not be here. Because what happened, look, the case against Trump in New York City, not the rape case, but the other one, it's not a strong case. You know, I mean, if asking a lawyer, it's a real questionable one. Why are we there? Because we lost shame. Had he been shamed, that case never would have been brought. So what happens is when you lose shame, you hurt the law and you hurt, you know, society. You know, and had Melania Trump thrown him out of the White House and said, you know, get out of here. What you did is terrible. We'd be in a different place.
Next question. Where is India today?
You know, so India's got, it's complicated. Obviously, it's I don't want to call it authoritarian, but it's got a leader who has got certain authoritarian tendencies. He's also done remarkable work for the poor, too, at the same time. So I just hope, I've always thought, I'm a huge Indiophile. I think that India is a miracle, a country of 1.4 billion people that holds free and fair elections every 4 years. If India were like Syria today, the whole world would be different. So as a shining example of democracy and pluralism, it's hugely important, and I just hope and pray that India holds to that legacy, because the world would be very different if it doesn't.
You've been writing about Israel for so many decades, and you've been writing quite critically about the Prime Minister Netanyahu, that his so-called judicial reform is actually a cover for a move towards kind of Hungarian-style autocracy. About a month ago, Netanyahu called off their push for judicial reform and said he was now entering negotiations. There's been leaks here and there that give the kind of patina of progress. What's your read? Are we heading for a big breakthrough in Israel?
No, basically the President Herzog in Israel is hosting supposedly a dialogue, a quiet, normal dialogue on electoral reform, but it really is just a holding pattern because no progress is being made there. Netanyahu and Kevin McCarthy are facing the exact same dilemma. Each man can either blow up his party or blow up the country he lives in. If McCarthy, refuses to raise the debt limit, he blows up America. If he agrees to do it, he blows up his party. If Netanyahu agrees to abandon electoral reform, he blows up his party. If he goes ahead with it, he blows up Israel. The two are in the exact same situation. And both countries are hanging in the balance.
So with Netanyahu, he can continue this charade of negotiation. And maybe I think that's the out. I think he'll do it for, Netanyahu famously is a man who loves to decide not to decide. By the way, it's why, he's many things, but he's not a warmonger, because he was always really very careful about exercising Israeli power. He appreciates how you can go too far. He never would have invaded Lebanon, the way Begin and Sharon did, I think. And even vis-a-vis Iran, as bellicose as he has been very, very careful, So my guess is, for a while at least, these talks at the president's residence will just go on, and eventually something will give. His coalition partners are so unstable, yet they all know that this may be their only chance in power, which is why they decided to go all the way. They knew they had one chance. It was a freak outcome, and they decided, even though they won by 1/10 of 1%, or something close to that, they decided to pretend they won a landslide, and they wanted to. It's Hungarian style, lock in their majority. And just to follow the thread on McCarthy.
Yeah.
McCarthy, how do we get out of the debt ceiling? Is McCarthy going to blow up the party or the country?
If I were betting now, 51-49, he blows up the country.
And is there going to be a group of maybe conservative Democrats?
Not he, but I mean his party will. I mean that he won't be able to bring around his party.
Would he be willing to cut a coalition with conservative Democrats?
I think there's a chance that if his party tries to oust him, that some conservative Democrats might step forward and actually vote to retain his leadership as a gesture respect and support for him making the hard decision. I wouldn't rule that out at all. I think we're in uncharted territory right now, and but I think there are a group of people in that party now, like in Netanyahu's government, that were basically, what happened to Netanyahu? It was really like McCarthy. Netanyahu lost so much support with his own party. Let's remember, he's under indictment. He's in a trial on 3 counts of corruption. So he lost so many people that in his own party that what did he have to do, Larry? He had to reach outside the fence and bring inside Israeli politics people who were never, ever there before. What did McCarthy have to do? In order to be elected speaker, he had to reach outside and make Marjorie Taylor Greene part of his inner circle. People who were, never thought of as inner circle material, put on appropriations in some of these, committees. So it's a lot of parallels between the two.
Fascinating.
And I think both are really, blow up the country, blow up the party,
Let me just give me a
It's a
second.
good column, actually, if you see that next week.
Just want to give a quick shout out to folks who are joining us online and here about upcoming programs. Next Wednesday, we have a national conference here on election administration and how to rebuild the profession of election administration. There are all-star election officials all over the country. That's May 10th, 10 a.m. If you go to our website, you will find a link to it. Please join us, or you can come to it live. And then in June 14th, we're starting a series, Conservative Voices from the Humphrey School, and we're having a conversation with Ramesh Ponaru, who's the editor of the National Review, and we're going to be talking about Ramesh's argument for restoring intellectual diversity on university campuses. I want to conclude with a couple thank yous. First, a warm thank you again to Kiyoshi Nagasaka for sponsoring the beginning of this series of conversations about the state of public life and encouraging progress towards our shared bonds. Also want to thank the amazing Tom Friedman.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Just amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's so much fun to talk with you because every realm of thought, politics, economics somehow makes it into the conversation.
Appreciate it.
And
Well,
it's thrilling.
It's a treat for me to talk to you. You've been a great thought partner for me, Larry, so thank you very much.
Okay, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.